chat, and then we will treat them at the end of the webinar. So if you allow me, I'll share my presentation. Okay, let me see. Yes, I think this is it. Yep. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Here we go. So, welcome everybody to the webinar on life sciences in Japan, Australia and Singapore. Let me first get you through the agenda, which should now be coming up. Am I in charge of the presentation? Yes, because I can't move the presentation. No. Ah, okay, here we go. Can you see the agenda?
Yes, we can.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Natalie, for being my spare partner here. We will start with an introduction to the Japanese market. I will do that myself, and then I will hand over to Alexander De Leeuw from Genie Japan, and he will explain about the life sciences sector in Japan. After that, my colleague in Melbourne, from FIT Melbourne, Luca Botello, will give some explanation on Australia, and then hand over the mic to Tanya Do and Jan Janssen for a presentation on life sciences in Australia. After that, my colleague in Singapore, Nathalie Surmont, will take over, and she will then explain about Singaporean market, and then hand over to Jean-Paul de Slipre for the life sciences sector in Singapore. And then after about 1 hour and 20 minutes, we will still have some time for questions and answer. Okay, let's go to Japan. Well, as you can see, Japan is really in the middle of the world. I suppose that's the case for every country, but you can see it's at the end of Asia, and then you have the Asia Pacific, and at the other end you have United States and the Americas. Not much to say about that. Let's go to the population of Japan. Well, Japan has 126 million inhabitants, and Japan has the most aged population of the world. So quite some elderly people here. The age society, the aging in the Japanese society is going that quickly that at this very moment the Japanese population is going down. 300,000 inhabitants, and it is expected that this will be 400,000 this year, and next year probably 500,000. Which means, of course, that Japan is losing something like 0.3% of its population every year, and this is even increasing probably next year 0.4%. What does that mean for Japan? Well, there are a number of factors. First, the depopulation of Japan is not everywhere the same in Japan. The major urban regions like Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, they have about 2/3 of the Japanese population, and they are still growing. But it's the other 1/3, which is in the countryside villages. That 1/3 of the Japanese population is really decreasing. So you see more and more small agriculture villages in Japan that are being abandoned because there's nobody left to live there. So there is clearly more and more people crowding into the cities. We are not sure whether COVID-19 is going to change that. It's an interesting dynamics to see, because people don't have to be in the center of a city anymore to work. Now, there is another point. If you don't have a lot of people, well, then also your workforce is going down. And this is, of course, one of the reasons why Japan has a very low unemployment rate. Even now, with COVID-19 crisis, Japan only has an unemployment rate of 3%, which they consider very high here in Japan. What else do you get with a population that's going down? Well, there is clearly an influence on the economic growth. Japan is still the third national economy worldwide, after the United States and after China. But since 2 decades, the growth of the annual growth of Japan is rather low. It's a success if they can get to 1% growth a year. Last year it was 0.7%. Of course, if your if your population is decreasing with something like 0.3%, well, it means that the remaining population has to produce or to consume 0.3% more just to stay at the same economic level as the year before. And if they do so, then you don't have any economic growth, then it's just zero growth. So if Japan wants to grow more, to get to 1%, it takes quite a lot. Population, the Japanese have to consume more, the remaining Japanese have to consume more, have to produce more, and it's not always sure that they want to do that. So to get to growth, the Japanese government in the last, I would say, 10 years have been really throwing money into the system to get some economic growth. Of course, this year it's going to be, as everywhere, not a very nice picture. The IMF expects a negative growth of 5.8% for Japan, and then a rebound next year, 2021, with probably something like 2.4%, depending, of course, how COVID-19 is evolving. If you don't have a lot of economic growth, you don't have a lot of inflation. The former Japanese Prime Minister Abe, who has been Prime Minister for the last 7-8 years and who resigned last month, well, his policy was to get to 2% inflation a year. As you can see, the last figure we have for inflation dates of August 2020. It was 1/10 of that, namely 0.2%. The Japanese Prime Minister Abe has tried several things. The Japanese bank has gone for a very soft monetary policy where it's really opening up the money to be thrown into the economy just by very low rates, even below 0%. And the Japanese government have been spending a lot of money. And as a result, you see that the government gross debt is in Japan 237% of GDP. In Belgium, that's 100%, and that's considered very high. If Japan would love to adopt the euro, well, then they have to go to 60% government debt of GDP. Otherwise, you cannot enter the European euro. It's the euro. It's one of these conditions. Now, Japan is 4 times that, so it doesn't look like they will adopt the euro. I would be surprised they would like to. But anyhow, isn't this a disaster? Is Japan not going to go bankrupt with such a huge government debt? Well, apparently not. If you look into that debt, 85%, well, to start with, all these government debts are in Japanese yen, and the Japanese yen, of course, is in the hands of the Japanese government, so that's already good. 85% of the government debt is in the hands of the Japanese institutional investors, so banks, pension funds, and so on. And among them, the biggest one is in fact the Bank of Japan. And the Bank of Japan is the national bank of Japan, and they have about 45% of the government debt in their hands. And this is increasing. Yeah, probably by next year or somewhere next year it will be half. So this is the policy of the Bank of Japan, to buy more government bonds from the Japanese government. And the Bank of Japan is managed by the government of Japan. So basically half of the government debt is owned by the Japanese government. And then the others are of banks and pension funds. So it doesn't look that bad as you would think when you see this figure. Why can Japan do that? Why can it afford such a huge government debt? It has to do with the trust that the international investment community has in the Japanese yen. You see, whenever there is a scare in the banking sector worldwide, investors will run maybe to gold, but for sure also to the Japanese yen, because they know the Japanese banking sector has been cleaned up in the 1990s and early 2000s, and that since then the Japanese banking system is very strong. Also, Japanese industry traditionally has a lot of cash in its coffers, so international investors are have a lot of trust in the Japanese yen. Luckily, otherwise it wouldn't be so nice for the Japanese government. Okay, I think I'm not gonna go deeper into the Japanese government debt, because that's not the theme of today. The theme of today is life sciences in Japan.
Sorry, there was, of course, the typical technical problem of the last second. Thank you, Dirk, and thank you to the participants to this webinar from Melbourne. Melbourne, unfortunately, is still in lockdown. We have been in lockdown since the first week of July. I would like to. I'll try to be brief because I'm conscious of the time, and of course now is trying to uploading the presentation. Sorry. This is not mine. Here we go. By the way, unfortunately, this is not my presentation, so I don't know if Dirk, you still have your presentation.
I don't think so, Luca. As far as I can see, I'm not sharing anything.
Okay, that's not mine as well. Okay, it should be. Okay, so as Dirk showed you a nice picture of the world map with Japan in the center. I must say that Australia shares the same situation. So because we are in a central location amongst many more countries and continents. 252 times larger than Belgium. Australia is a federation made of 6 states and 2 territories. The population, 90% of the Australian population lives in urban areas, with, let's say, 67% living in the capital cities of Australia. So, of course, the Australian capital is Canberra, but we have other major cities such as Sydney and Melbourne. The 2 cities together normally makes around 40% of the total population. We have a multicultural and young population with nearly 19% with less than 14 years old. So a bit different from the presentation before. From an economic point of view, Australia has been the lucky country for 28 years, reporting an uninterrupted GDP growth. But the economic consequences from COVID-19 have changed the outlook. So the expected 6% recession in 2020 will be only partly recovered in 2021, when the Reserve Bank of Australia is expecting to have a growth of 5%. Let's say that Australia is still the 14th economy in the world, but we can expect that the GDP per capita will drop. So at the moment is the 10th in the world, so it's a, let's say, rich country, but the dramatic and pandemic situation of related to COVID is changing, as I say, the outlook, and also the Australian gross debt will dramatically increase. Yesterday evening, the government presented the federal budget that includes several billions to support the local economy. But unfortunately, the financial assistance will create a net debt of almost 1 trillion of Australian dollars by the end of 2024. And previously, the federal government had an objective to basically reduce the net debt. Unfortunately, it's going the other way around. Due to money supporting the job recovery, the forecast unemployment rate, we see that instead of being around 10%, will be probably 7.1%, and forecast next year say that it will be around 5%. So much higher than the 3% from Japan and higher than the average 5% here in Australia. I didn't want to take too much time because, as we say, the presentation will be more about the life sciences in Australia. So I'd like to introduce one of the keynote speakers, Tanya Ado, Director of Membership and Engagement of the National Pig Industry Association, Ausbiotech. Tanya, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Luca, and also to Flanders Investment and Trade. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today and to inform you a little bit more about Osbiotech. I'll just put my slide up, won't be a second. Now, hopefully you can all see my slide, all right? So I would just like to, first of all, start by saying that, once again, I'm very pleased to be able to join you today. And Ausbiotech is the industry association for biotechnology in Australia. We're a national organisation. We've been around for about 35 years, and we're very, very fortunate to have the support of all the major organisations in the sector. We have, as I mentioned, about 3,000 members. We're quite unusual because there's only probably about 3 organisations, industry associations in the world that represents the full pipeline for biotechnology. So we represent all the therapeutics, the medical device diagnostics and digital health, also agri-tech, food, and all the service providers in the sectors, from the large, accounting firms to prototype designers to law firms, institutes, and research organisations. So one of the other things that sets us apart too is that we raise capital for the sector, which is extremely important. So I'll just go to my next slide now. So it won't be a moment. So Australia, whilst I absolutely understand that people are talking today about, COVID as well, and which is, a global, it's had global impact across the world. There's also some very good positive stories with COVID as well. So I think right across the world at the moment, people many people on their, the normal average person wouldn't even know much about science or know about a pandemic or, or to think about that there could be a vaccine soon. So, I really do see that whilst I understand every country is going to go through some very, very challenging times, for our sector, it is actually one of the best times for our sector because, we've got terrific collaborations going on throughout all of the countries as well. So I'll talk to that a bit further, but Australia's got a mature and thriving sector with about 240,000 employed, and we've got about 1,000 people working on commercialisation at the moment. On the Australian Stock Exchange, we have about 160 life science companies worth about 200 billion, which is equivalent to about the US dollars of being about 1.3 billion. So one thing that Ausbiotech does is that we do facilitate global engagement and in strong established markets, and we foster, growing and strong profitable sector. Australia has world-class regulatory and government programs supporting us and big biotech deals which have resulted from our favourable environment, highlighting our regenerative medicine and clinical trials capabilities. As I mentioned before, COVID has also produced, unprecedented global collaboration, for many of us, the Australian companies. Sorry. Just my next slide. Right, so the Australian government recognises that the life science sector is an important economic driver for our economy. The research and development tax incentive is absolutely crucial for our clinical trials capabilities. The research and development tax incentive offers tax offsets and refunds for companies who are investing in research and development. The incentive can be accessed by international companies under certain circumstances. However, many international organisations are setting up in Australia to take full advantage of the tax incentives. Australia offers a globally competitive position because we are cost effective and have high quality. We also have two major programs supporting tech companies. One is the Medical Research Futures Fund, and also the Biotechnology Translation Fund. The Medical Research Future Fund, when fully capitalised, will be about $20 billion, and in total around $4 billion is invested each year in Australia by our sector. Going back to sort of clinical trials, Australia conducts approximately 1,000 clinical trials annually and is growing about 5% per year. Australia is a low-risk test market for global deployment with established and experienced clinical trial centres with needle-to-needle supply chain support available. Australia should also be seen as a stepping stone into Western markets for Asian companies, combining these regulatory and access opportunities with established and proven pathway of obtaining high quality clinical data recognised by US and European regulators that makes for a compelling opportunity for Australia. Australia is in a globally competitive position because we are cost effective in early phase clinical trial. Australia is 28% cheaper than the US before tax incentives and 60% cheaper after tax incentives. To give you an example, one of the things that Australia, as I mentioned about clinical trials, it is something that we're very proud of, that we do get a lot of inquiries about this all the time. We lead the Australian delegation to BioUSA. We manage the Australian Pavilion. Virtually every single person that comes to that pavilion from countries all around the world comes to speak to us about our clinical trials capabilities. So that's something that, you know, may be of great interest to some of your companies too. I'd like to also talk about the regenerative medicine sector as well. Regenerative medicine is certainly, you know, one of Australia's newest and rapidly emerging life sciences fields. The industry estimates the global market to reach about 120 billion by 2035, and we are well on our way to capturing a segment of this market. Australia was the first industry-sponsored CAR-T patient treated outside of North America and has had our first therapy approved by the Australian regulator in 2018. In 2019, the regulator issued its first cell therapy manufacturing license. Australia announced a new manufacturing facility in Melbourne, the first in Australia, the first in Asia, and one of the first in the world. 150 million government investment into a 10-year Australian stem cell therapies mission through the Medical Research Fund. Australia has a rapid 14-day clinical trial notification scheme for first in human and individual approved trials, and we have a strong biologics framework in place since 2011. So in regard to regenerative medicine as well, we have many collaborations with the countries that we've joined today. So we're very pleased about that. The last slide that I have here, I just highlight that it says the Ausbiotech and Invest event that we have here. So Australia has been running the largest life science conference in Australia for over 35 years. With COVID, it's the first time we'll be running it as a virtual event this year. But with our conference, we are not an academic conference. We're all about business. All the global lead and search development teams fly into this conference. We have a huge program, a 3-day program, and we have clinical trial streams to regenerative medicine streams with all the leading catalyst organisations in the world participating in these streams. Particularly for regenerative medicine. We also work closely, as I mentioned, with all the big pharma companies. It has also a medical device stream as well, and it goes for 3 days. 2 of the key areas of this conference, one is the investment summit. We run the largest summit in Australia, and it normally has between about 15 early stage to 15 late stage companies presenting, and raises capital, and is so important, raises capital for the sector. We also host investment summits prior to COVID, of course, in Hong Kong and Shanghai, and we also lead a delegation to JP Morgan in San Francisco, normally in January, once again pre-COVID. We would certainly love to see this. It's coming up in late October. If any of you that may be interested, if you're wanting to, think about entering into the Australian market, or you're interested in partnering, we run all of our event has one-on-one business matching programming, so that you can have that will all be on Zoom this year. So that's all part of your registration cost. And I'm pleased to say that I've been working with Luca, and we have a special rate, like we're offering you member rates if you're interested in coming. So I can send you we'll give you more information after that. If you look down at the right-hand side of the screen too, we also run the largest medical device and diagnostic conference in Australia, and so we would, very much welcome, if any of you would like to come along to that too. So thank you so much. I really do appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Tanya. Very interesting data, and also, I must say that the federal budget yesterday basically allocated 1.5 billion Australian dollar for what they call a modern manufacturing strategy. And there are 6 streams in this strategy, and medical devices is one of them. So 1.5 billion, extra billion for the next 4 years. So it's quite interesting. I would like to give the floor to Jan Jansen, Chief Technology Officer of Cochlear. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you, Luca, and thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. In my short slot, I will share with you some Flemish perspectives on Australia. I live and work in Australia, but I'm originally Belgian, dual citizen at the moment. I'm studied in Leuven, as I'm sure many of people online. I serve as officer at Cochlear. I started actually my career in Philips in Leuven as an electronics engineer, but then moved into cochlear implants in the mid-90s in a small Belgian startup called Antwerp Bionic Systems, but I was acquired by Cochlear in 2000. That led to the establishment of our Cochlear Technology Centre, which is our largest R&D centre outside Australia, which we have in Mechelen, and that I managed for a few years. And then in 2003, I moved with my family to Australia, and I've been there since then. And so over those years, for most of that period, I've been in charge of research and development, although at the moment I combine that role with also accountability for business development and quality and regulatory affairs. Cochlear works in the field of hearing loss. Now, hearing loss is prevalent, but also undertreated. According to the World Health Organization, over 460 million people suffer from hearing loss. And obviously for those over 65, 1 in 3 suffers from hearing loss to an extent that it's really impacting their life. And there's more and more evidence, by the way, that hearing loss is not just an inconvenience. It is linked with a number of comorbidities, including strong indication of a correlation with dementia. Now, Cochlear operates as solutions for people that suffer from so-called severe to profound hearing loss. So that means that people have more than 70 decibel of loss, and that accounts for about 10% of those people that have hearing loss that fall in that category. And so the main device that we have for that is called a Cochlear Implant. So the name of the company is the same as the type of the device. We estimate that there's about 15 million people around the world that could be treated for the severe to profound hearing loss with a cochlear implant, but today less than 1 in 20 has been in fact implanted with a cochlear implant. To explain a bit what we do, what you see on the screen here is how normal hearing works. This is how you're listening to the presentation today. The sound is entering your ear canal. It makes through the small bones, through the ossicles, it makes your fluid inside your inner ear move. And your inner ear is actually a transducer that transduces that movement into electrical signals to your hearing nerve. Now, if you suffer from severe or profound hearing loss, then that translation that happens in your inner ear doesn't work anymore because the hair cells in your inner ear are damaged, and so therefore the vibrations cannot be translated anymore into electrical pulses to your hearing nerve. So the way that level of hearing loss or the type of hearing loss can be treated today is through a cochlear implant. So a cochlear implant basically bypasses most of the normal hearing channel. It consists of an external part that's called a sound processor that contains microphones and a processing unit that transmits the information to the implant, and the implant then electrically stimulates the inner ear through an array of very small electrodes that send small electrical pulses that are being picked up by the hearing nerve. So here you see the device that's been surgically implanted. You see here the curly part, that's the part that goes into the inner ear. The titanium case here has a microchip that does a decoding of the information that's being received by the external component. That's called the sound processor. So that's basically what the company does. So Cochlear develops, manufactures, and distributes and sells these products. It is an Australian success story. The company is about 40 years old. We are a publicly listed company headquartered in Australia. You see here a picture of our headquarters here in Australia. It's a global company, so whilst we're headquartered in Australia, 95% of what we manufacture is being sold and implanted outside Australia. We have significant presence in Europe, including a research and development site in Mechelen, where we also have our distribution for the Benelux is also done out of Mechelen, and a number of other sites around the globe. A few facts about the company. So last year we did 1.4 billion Australian dollar in revenue. It was a little bit lower than what we expected, of course, because of COVID. By the way, in Australia, the fiscal year runs from July 1 to June 30. So our fiscal year numbers that you see here are the numbers from the last fiscal year. We have about 4,000 employees around the world. Over the 40 years that Cochlear has been in operation, about 600,000 people have received one of our devices. We operate or we distribute our products in about 180 countries. And over the lifetime of the company, we've invested about 2 billion in research and development. So although it's today an established therapy, Cochlear still invests about 12% of what we sell into research and development. As I mentioned, we're an Australian listed company and often used as an example, as a textbook example of a medical device success story in Australia. And the company's market capitalization is about $13 billion at the moment. So then a few elements that I'd like to share from being in Australia for 17 years. As a Belgian living and working here, like Lucas said, Australia is a highly developed and urbanized country. I think many of you that might not have been in Australia often think of Australia as the outback, and of course there's a lot of that, but there's hardly anyone living there. So most of the people actually live in cities or in suburbs around cities or in regional towns, and from that perspective it's actually not that different from living in Belgium. So whilst the country is a lot larger than Belgium, I find actually there's quite some similarities. One of them being, and it's not on my slides here, that there's a little bit of an underdog mentality, particularly towards bigger countries like the UK and certainly the US. And I think that's something that we have a little bit in common between Belgium and Australia. Australians are in general easy to work with, just like Belgians are, in my experience. It's a federal country, again, a bit like Belgium, although we have 5 states here and 2 territories. What is different from Belgium is that here every state has their own legislation, their own legal system. And so whilst in Belgium we have it's a federal country, but we have one legal system, here every state has its own legal system, which is a little bit of a nuisance. but overall it's not too different in the way that the law operates here in different parts of the country. Like we also heard from Tanya and Luca, it's a wealthy country with a good investment climate. There's a significant amount of funding available and public and private investment available. It's a country with an excellent medical infrastructure, and I think one of the ways that oops, just checking if I'm still in the meeting. I got a message here. That something went wrong. Luca, can you confirm that I'm still in the meeting?
Yes, you are.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. So excellent medical infrastructure, and in fact, Australia has done extremely well during the COVID crisis, I have to say, and it's a little bit of course helped by the fact that it's an island, but the numbers were not that different a few months ago. But at the moment in New South Wales, the state where I live here in Sydney, we have a number of days where there was 0 cases, and if I see and compare the way that the testing is organized, the speed by which it's happening, and I compare that with what I read about what's happening in Belgium, then I think it's a good example that medical infrastructure is on par, if not better than what I was used to in Belgium. Significant biotech research, as we heard from Tanya. Of course, it's a small market, so biotech here will look globally, which is also what Cochlear did when it was established in the 1980s. It had a global outlook from the beginning, and that's surely been one of the success factors in Cochlear's success, which as a relative, of course, coming out of a relative small country, Cochlear is still the market leader in our field, so we have about 60% market share globally. In terms of education, it's I would say similar if you look at the PISA surveys, so that's the surveys that are done with high school students, then the Belgian scores and Australian scores are actually very similar. Population is very tech savvy, and is my experience quite an early adopter usually of technology. Another example is that we had a COVID ad here months before we had a COVID ad in Belgium. Australia is ranks very well on the Corruption Perception Index, so it's a country that has a good legal system and also law-abiding citizens and society, which makes it, of course, an attractive country to invest in, and does actually a little bit better than Belgium in that. Excellent quality of life. One of the reasons that we've stayed here for so long is that, of course, Australia is a very pleasant country to live in. Melbourne and Sydney typically are in the top 5 of the most livable cities in the world. It's a very multicultural society, and definitely a multicultural success story. And culture, I feel that it's a bit of a hybrid between the UK, Europe, and the US. And depending on which part of Sydney that you live, or which part of Australia that you live, is going to feel a bit more like one of those. But of course, also has very significant Asian influence as well. In terms of healthcare, it's a mixed public-private healthcare system. So about half the population has a public health insurance, and about the other half has a private health insurance. In both systems, the level of medical care is very good. You have a bit more freedom if you're in the private healthcare system, but overall, I would say the difference in outcomes is not that different between public and private healthcare. Like Tanya said, very favorable clinical trial regulation. Also, although perhaps underline it as an example, so Cochlear, of course, is a hearing company, but we have some activities outside hearing. We are a shareholder in actually a Belgian startup called Nixoa. It's a company out of the Walloon region, just out of Brussels, and they have developed an implantable device to treat sleep apnea. They actually went public a few weeks ago. Some of you might have seen that in the business newspapers. And Nixoa ran their clinical study in Australia. So although at that time Cochlear was not involved with Nixoa, they had figured out that Australia is actually a very good country to run clinical studies. And of course, perhaps another reason is that in Australia sleep apnea is very well known, because also the market leader for sleep apnea is actually the global market leader is an Australian company called ResMed. And then finally, 2 things that are worth mentioning. The medical device approval happens here by the TGA, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, and can typically leverage CE approval. And there's also a favorable R&D tax incentive. It's a bit different from the grant system that Belgium has, that Flanders has, which is also a very good system, and we actually use that quite a bit for our activities, R&D activities that we have in Flanders. In Australia, it's a different system, and it works through the tax incentive, but it's also a system that definitely encourages research and development. So I'll leave it there, and I hope that I've been able to share with you some insights about living in Australia and in the way that society works here. Back over to you, Luca.
Thank you, Jan.
Yeah. Thank you, Jan. I will take over for Singapore. Very interesting, of course, all of this. And you mentioned that the COVID app was ready a couple of months before Belgium, but obviously that COVID app was actually developed in Singapore, and Singapore gave it for use to the other countries. So good morning, everyone. I'm Nathalie Saumon. I'm the Trade Commissioner in Singapore and Brunei. I'm also the regional coordinator for South and Southeast Asia, and I've been in Asia for 22 years now. And so my main task is to help Flemish companies doing business here. So most of you are familiar probably with Singapore, but I'll give a short introduction. I will start sharing my screen, and I hope you can see everything now. Yeah, we are in Singapore. So compared, of course, to Australia and Japan, Singapore is really small. Yeah, Singapore is about 42 times smaller than Belgium. But still, the population is about half of Belgium, so 5.7 million inhabitants. That's about the same number as Flemish people, but just in a smaller space. I added a map, but you hardly can see actually Singapore on it. In terms of population, it's maybe also interesting to note that there's quite a lot of foreigners. Yeah, about 1.3 million people here are either expats or foreign workers. A lot of domestic helpers as well come from surrounding countries. Now, Singapore is also well known, unfortunately, for the high cost of living. When we look at accommodation, it's easily double or triple the price we're used to in Belgium. Owning a car here is even more expensive, about 3 to 4 more than in Belgium. Alcohol, very important, is also expensive, with prices being 2 or 3 times of what we are used to. But on the other hand, we have very cheap food options like the very famous hawker centers, and we have cheap and excellent public transport. So COVID-19, well, in Singapore, they handled it quite well, but we had several waves. So in the beginning, there were a few cases starting already in January. There was immediately action taken. There was a rule made to put people in quarantine and so on. But then a second wave that primarily involved the migrant workers, and those migrant workers live in dormitories. And of course, once the pandemic or the virus took hold there, quite a lot of cases came up. So today we have had about 56,000 cases. But what is really exceptional is that until today, we have only about 42 people who died. So that's really quite exceptional. And I must say, for the last couple of weeks, for the last 4 weeks, we had on average less than 1 case a day. But still, the rules are quite strict. Yeah, we can still only meet with maximum 5 people. We still cannot travel, or there's very little travel possible, only as an exception. And maybe also what is different from Belgium, the enforcement of the rules are very strict. So we mentioned also Australia has a good quality of life. I'm sure Japan has that as well. If you compare the quality of life between Antwerp, Brussels and Singapore, again, we're at very similar levels. I know it's a bit of a different for every person what you consider quality of life. But in that quality of life, of course, there's the healthcare. Yeah, and the healthcare is what we are talking about today. Singapore is very well known for good quality healthcare, both private and public. But we will hear about that a bit later. Which brings me also to doing business in Singapore. So if you look at Singapore, although very small, they really like to be first. And if you look at the many rankings that exist, they're first on quite a number of them. So they're, for example, the least risky country in the world for investment. They have the best political and operational stability. They are the best performing smart city. They are the best Asian digital transformation environment. They're the most competitive economy in the world. They're also second in ease of doing business according to the World. And they are also the fourth largest recipient of foreign direct investment, which is quite, I would say, unique for such a small country. They also have the fourth largest GDP per capita in the world, and that brings them just behind some oil-rich states. The economy is quite diversified, although they have a hub or international hub function for logistics. Also, the legal sector becomes more important. Yeah, they try to be the mediation center of the region. They're obviously a travel hub, and they're also a medical hub. So a lot of patients from surrounding countries come to Singapore for medical treatment. A lot of people from Indonesia, from Bangladesh, Vietnam. Of course, now with COVID-19, because traveling has stopped, this also has actually stopped. So the crisis or the impact for Singapore is quite big. But on the other hand, Singapore has deep pockets and they have been saving money. So they spent in the last couple of months nearly 100 billion Singapore dollar, which translates in about 65 billion euros. And with that, they helped, in first place, maybe the salaries for people so they could remain working and the jobs could survive. But actually, they also invested a lot in transformation for the future. Singapore is a country that really plans ahead. Yeah, they plan 10, 20 years ahead, and they're also very good at executing their plans. And some of the plans they had was, for example, create 30% of food production or nutritional value for the people within Singapore. Yeah, today almost all food is being imported. Well, they're working very hard at changing that. Another sector they are focusing on is obviously healthcare. So although they have a very good healthcare, they want actually to start producing locally medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, and so on. And recently I talked to someone who is into the construction they construct for pharmaceutical companies or labs. And he said over the last 10 years, they only had one big project. And now they actually have about 10 of them in the pipeline. So that's all very interesting. But the real specialist I would like to introduce today is someone who was trained as a medical doctor, who has more than 20 years of experience as professor at the University of Ghent, who also worked 3 years as director for clinical research and was professor at the National University of Singapore, who has worked and traveled really extensively in the Asia region. It's really an honor to welcome you, Professor Jean-Paul de Slijpere, CEO of Aesculape, a clinical trial company, which has branches in both Singapore and Belgium. Dear Jean-Paul, please take it away. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Hello. Thanks a lot, Natalie. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody. My name is indeed Jean-Paul de Slippere, and at this moment I'm the CEO of Aesculape, which is a clinical research organization. We have our headquarters in Singapore and offices in different Southeast Asian countries, but we are also located in Europe, and in Belgium our office is in Belzele. Here you see, let us say, a more close-up view of Singapore, where you basically see that Singapore is an island. It's an island with two bridges towards Malaysia, and that's it. Now, the two bridges are important because this will allow relatively cheap labor to come every day from Malaysia to Singapore to work in the manufacturing industry. A second thing that you see is in the bottom part of the slide, you see Batam. Batam belongs to Indonesia, and in Batam there are also industry parks, so quite some Singapore companies have been setting up manufacturing, cheaper manufacturing capabilities in Batam. Batam is quite easy to reach out of Singapore by ferry. This is a even closer view of Singapore. On the right hand, the eastern part of the country, you have Changi, where most of us or nearly all of us land when we are coming to Singapore. And then on the bottom of the country, you see Tuas and Jurong Island. These are two major manufacturing hubs, also for the pharmaceutical industry. And then in the middle, you have the research facilities where you see Jurong East, Singapore Science Center. There you have the National University of Singapore, you have Biopolis, you have A-Star, so the scientific hub of Singapore. Singapore is a rock, and by this I basically mean two things. First of all, when Singapore started, there was nothing. There are no natural resources. You don't have big forests. You don't have grasslands. So everything which is present in Singapore has to be imported, has to be made, and that's very important. But you also can say that Singapore is a rock for other reason, namely it is, and that has already been pointed out by Natalie, it's a very stable country. When you look at the last 10 years and you look at Asia, you have seen disasters, political turmoil, and so on in many, many countries, except for Singapore. So Singapore is also on the mid and the long term a very safe bet. This is a picture of a part of Singapore, but it resumes a little bit what is going on and what is part of Singapore. On the left upper side, you see the casino, the iconic hotel, the submarine, and this was in fact initiated because at one time Singapore had a very clever idea of also going into the casino business, and that's one of the two casinos in Singapore. On the far right, you see all these skyscrapers, and these symbolize Singapore as a financial hub. And I think that every bank has its skyscraper. On the forefront, on the bottom, you see what is called the durian. This is a concert hall, and this symbolizes the fact that Singapore is also putting interest and emphasis on the cultural sector. And then finally, the middle part on the right side of the slide, you see here the Fullerton Hotel, the old post office, which is now a nice hotel to say, symbolizes Singapore of the past. Now, in Singapore at the present time, you have 4 pillars: the advanced manufacturing and engineering, health and biomedical science, urban solutions and sustainability, and then services and digital economy. These are explained in this slide, and where basically the advanced manufacturing and engineering is to develop technological capabilities. And I put the emphasis on advanced because the basic manufacturing has mostly left Singapore. That was something for 20, 30 years ago, where Singapore was an important hub, for example, for basic IT industry, hard drive, and so on. Now this role has been taken over by other countries, so Singapore is following up, evolving, and is going into an advanced mode. And then you have urban solutions and sustainability. So Singapore again was it in front of its time. And for example, it's already a long time that Singapore is looking at the problem water resourcing, how can we get water, and as we all know, water will become one of the big problems in the future. And then the service and digital economy. There again, Singapore is putting quite some effort in digital innovation. Now we are focusing on health and biomedical sciences, where Singapore is looking on the manufacturing, the developing of new drugs and compounds, but is also looking at the testing of the drug, and then is also looking at offering these drugs, medical devices, and so on, to not only the Singapore population, but also, population from other parts of the world. Investment, Singapore is a country which is keeping its promises. It is, as you can see, investments in the country are growing at a steady state. These figures are in Singapore dollar, and we know that €1 is 1.6 Singapore dollar, $1 is 1.4 Singapore dollar. And the latest plan is the Research, Innovation and Enterprise Plan of 2020, gives an investment of 19 billion Singapore dollar, of which 1/5 is for health and biomedical services. And that again is more completely presented in these slides. You see that the combination of health and biomedical science and academic research gives nearly 7 billion of Singapore dollar. And the aim of the Health and Biomedical Science Initiative is to make Singapore a leading center, a hub, definitely in the region, or maybe one of the hubs in the world for health and biomedical. Priorities, when we look at diseases, priorities are cancer. Why cancer? So Singapore is very interested to look into new treatments for cancer. Why? Because cancer is an important cause of mortality, and also because Singaporeans and Asians are sometimes reacting differently to cancer treatments. So, and also have different side effects. So the time that, or the period that drugs were developed in the West, clinical trials were done in the West, and then the same dosages were used in Singapore and Asia are behind us, because Asians are different and you must really use different dosages in cancer chemotherapeutics, but also for other treatments. For example, statins for hyperlipemia, dosages are also different. Cardiovascular diseases are also, like everywhere else in the world, very important. And while, let us say, there was not so much of cardiovascular disease, by adapting Western habits, also cardiovascular diseases make their entry in Singapore. And cardiovascular diseases are important because one of the signs, of one of the ways they are shown, is cerebrovascular diseases. And cerebrovascular diseases are very common in Singapore. And because they are coming, because you have a lot of strokes, you have a lot of transient ischemic attacks, you have also much faster dementia, for example. You have much faster certain neurological diseases, which again become a problem. Diabetes, there is definitely a kind of higher sensitivity in Chinese population, in Indian population, but also in Malay population for diabetes. And we already now have figures of 20% prevalence, 30% prevalence of diabetes in Singapore and in the region. When you compare that with Belgium, where it is 4%, there is a big difference. And then we have infectious diseases. Infectious diseases, not only the one that we all know, SARS and COVID, but also infectious diseases, for example, like dengue, which is less known or not known in Belgium, but which is a big problem for Singapore. So these are the priorities. Now, Singapore is also interested in innovative treatment. So they are not so interested in generics or biosimilars or this kind of medicine. No, they want really new breakthrough drugs. They are also interested in medical devices. They are interested in that because of the Chinese heritage in TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, and also in nutraceuticals. And some big companies active in the field have set up their regional, not only their regional headquarters, but also R&D. So for these are all priorities of the government. The hospital system, you have a public hospital, which is a public system, which is very active and which is necessary, because not everybody in Singapore has a lot of money. Now, the two major public hospital systems in Singapore are the National Healthcare Group and SingHealth. And this is a good example of the fact that Singapore believes, also in government circles, believes in competition. They think that if there would be one government body in a particular sector, the body would become lazy, would provide less good service, and because of the monopoly. So that's why from the beginning, in fact, they went into a system for most of the government bodies to have two entities, so there would be competition. Beside the public sector, there is the private sector, where the most important group is Parkway Hospital. Parkway Hospital groups with hospitals like Mount Elizabeth and Gleneagles, and they play an important role in medical tourism. Now, the medical care in Singapore is excellent and is at the same level as in Europe or in the US. So Singapore tries or has made the commitment since about 20 years with Biopolis to play an important role in the development of new drugs. And you see here quite a simplified scheme how new drugs are developed. You first have the research and development, then of course you need to manufacture them, but then you have to test them, you have to put them on the market, and then you have the commercialization. The market in Singapore is, well, relatively small. It's about $1 billion US. The drug market in Singapore is $1 billion US, which can seems to be a little bit low, but when you know that in Malaysia it is a little bit more than 2 billion, and in Thailand it is 6 billion, then the figure of Singapore of 1 billion is not that bad. Singapore sometimes likes to compare itself with Ireland, and to a certain degree it can be compared, and then you will see that Singapore certainly must not be considered the smaller party or the smaller brother when you look at the number of companies in Singapore compared with Ireland, when you also look at the government funding, which is of a considerable amount in Singapore, as we saw it. And at the bottom, you see that the most important sites where research development is done in Singapore is Biopolis. Tuas is also where the manufacturing is done, and Science Park is also a hub for labs. This is a slide which summarizes, in fact, the whole ecosystem in where you have really a good interaction between the government, that is the upper part left, with, for example, the Economic Development Board and the Ministry of Trade and Industry. These are two important names in Singapore at the government level. Then you have the different R&D hubs, with A-Star is again an important agency. NMRC, the National Medical Research Council, the Singapore Clinical Research Institute, and then, of course, the universities. And it is maybe worthwhile to say that in worldwide rankings, Singapore universities are always ranked in the top. Not only National University of Singapore, but also Nanyang Technological University are always in the top 50. Now, on the other hand, you have the hospital system with MOH, that's on the right part, the Ministry of Health, and then the different agencies who are helping the drug development. And you see HSA. HSA is the Health Science Authority of Singapore. In Australia, this was the TGA, the Therapeutic Goods Administration. In Singapore, it is HSA. And then you have the healthcare institutions that we already saw. So what is important for the Singapore government is the fact that the Singapore population would get access to the newest drug, to innovative treatments, also to cell and gene therapy, where different companies are very active in Singapore. So the Singapore government want really the best for their population and also for other people who are living there. And of course, they are very willing to export it and to other countries. In order to do this, they need a lot of talented people. They need a pool. They don't have enough talented people in Singapore, and that's why they invite people from China, from Japan, from Australia, US, and Europe to come and work in Singapore. And the government is really creating excellent conditions for people to work there, also with their family. So by this, Singapore wants to become a hub for R&D, and I think they are successful. And also they become a regional medical hub beside Thailand and India. But still, I think that Singapore has an excellent quality label for medical tourism. R&D output in Singapore is increasing also, as you can see, for biomedical and related sciences. Not only the R&D output is increasing, but also the manufacturing value added. And these figures are in Singapore dollar. So 12 billion Singapore dollar is the value add in 2016 for pharmaceutical and biological products. So there again, the pharmaceutical, the Singapore government has had a very good strategy and was really looking at advance. The fear of the Singapore government was that in case of pandemics, in case of health problems, the big countries would oblige pharmaceutical companies to produce only for the big country itself. And what would create a problem for smaller countries like Singapore. And that was one of the reasons why the Singapore government attracted so many pharmaceutical companies to set up a manufacturing site in Singapore. And you go to TUAS and you do a tour in TUAS and you see the who's who of the pharmaceutical industry. All these buildings are there and they secure, in fact, manufacturing of life-saving drugs, not only for Singapore, but also for the region. Now, when we look at the clinical trial application in Singapore, you see that clinical trial applications has gone down, and not too much, but a little bit. And the reason is a repositioning of Singapore in the clinical trial field. Here you see that most of the clinical trials are in oncology, which makes sense because in Singapore we need to find how local people react on the classic chemotherapeutic medicine, and this is then followed by other therapeutic domains. Now, the reason why the clinical trial applications are a little bit stabilizing, decreasing, is that in Singapore there is a shift from what is known as phase 3 and phase 2 trials to phase 1 trials. These are the first in human trials. These are very interesting trials, and these are tailor-made for Singapore. Singapore, because of its smaller population, is not so well fitted for large-scale phase 3 trials. So it's a repositioning of Singapore in the clinical trial field. So in Singapore, you have different ministries which are very active. If you want to set up shop in Singapore, what I really would advise you, it is an excellent country to start if you want to do business in Asia. So you see the Ministry of Trade and Industry, Ministry of Health, Manpower, the Accounting Authority, Central Provident Fund as a pension, Economic Development Board is the information agency, PR agency of Singapore, and then of course we cannot forget the Inland Revenue, the tax authority. By the way, taxes in Singapore are very easy. Now, there are different, let us say, government bodies who will help you actively if you want to come to Singapore. This is a list. When you want to set up a company in Singapore, it's very simple. You can do it yourself, or you can ask the help of some companies. You need an accountant, but that's very easy to find. It is better to open an account with a Singapore bank, and they offer excellent services. And then, of course, if you have some nostalgia, you can contact the embassy, you can contact Natalie, and you can contact the Belgium-Luxembourg Chamber of Commerce. Grants, these are two links for grants. You have different grants in Singapore to set up your company, to do the research, and they are really advantageous. Now, I think this is my last slide. When you start your business in Singapore, of course, and that's true for all countries, you need to be informed. You don't take the plane and trust the first person you meet in Changi Airport. You need to take information. You have enough people who can give you advice. To work, you can only work if you have an employment pass. So law is very much restricted in and enforced in Singapore, and if you don't follow the rules, then you get free accommodation in a hotel beside Singapore airport, which is called Changi Prison. So it is important when you do business in Singapore, it is important that you are present, and it is not a good idea to set up an operation in Singapore and stay the whole time in Belgium. Sorry, but you need to be present either full time or part of the time. So Singapore is definitely one of the best places to do business. I arrived in Singapore in 1997, and I'm still in Singapore. It is extremely safe. you can leave your family, your young children, nothing will happen. It's very nice to live. Starting business is also very, very easy. So I would advise you, please look into Singapore, and we would be very happy to welcome you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for this very interesting overview on Singapore. Actually, we ran over time, and that will not leave us time for any questions. I would first of all like to thank all the speakers of today. I think it was really relevant and interesting. Thank you for your contributions. Also, thank you to all my event, both in front of the screen and behind of the screen. I'm thinking about Christophe and Sabine and Ralph. Thank you also to all the companies calling in. We are there. FIT is still there. We are here to help you. And I know doing business in these days is different than in usual times. But we have our networks, and we are happy to help you. We can still make appointments for you. I know you would prefer to fly to our countries and see people face to face. It will just not happen anytime soon. So make the best of it. Try some digital events, both via FIT or other organizations. And I hope to see you in person or on a digital platform. Thank you, everyone, and keep healthy. Thank you.
Thank you.